Good morning, class. We're going to spend a few minutes today talking about talking about fellowship as we jump into chapter 4 in the text, but I want to spend just a few minutes, as I typically do, trying to go back and review some of the things we learned in chapters, especially 1, 2, but most importantly, chapter 3. Chapter 3, we talked about leadership and building relationships, and the authors get into the leader member exchange, LMX. They talk about tangible and intangible. Tangible is more monetary, raises, bonuses, stock options, maybe more personal time off or vacation, maybe more sick time. Intangibles, having individuals that almost like to be left alone and do their job. Maybe it entails more, positive work assignments, some of those type things. But those are kind of the exchange currencies where they talk about LMX. And then they get into the in groups and the out groups and the LMX dilemmas. How do you manage those individuals that get in the out group? So in groups, pretty easy to understand. They're go-getters. They're the type of individual that strives to do better. They don't dodge responsibility. They're always up for additional responsibility. They accept accountability if there is a mistake. So that's kind of the in group, which to me is fairly straightforward. It's the out group, and how do you manage those? And the out group tend to be individuals that maybe don't agree with the leader's strategy or the leader's vision or the leader's focus. Maybe they're individuals that only manage to the minimum. Most of the organizations that I've worked for, as you set goals and go through evaluations, there's a goal that meets expectations. That's kind of the bare minimum, and that's what you'll find a lot of these individuals in the out group trying to hit, is just meets expectations. Then you've got an exceeds expectations goal, and then you've got a stretch goal. And what you find on the in group, they're just kind of like looking at the two tails of a distribution. The out group is down here on just meets the goals. They just want to barely get by. Like to work if it's an 8-hour day, they want to work 8 hours, and they aren't gonna work any more than 8 hours, and they want to go home. And you've got the in group up here on the other tail of the distributions. They're looking at that, those exceeds goals, especially those stretch goals, and they'll work additional hours. They'll come in and help you on weekends. So it's just two different groups. And the out group is really the bane of a lot of leaders, because they are extremely difficult to manage, extremely difficult to mentor and to motivate. And it makes a manager or a leader's job somewhat difficult in most situations. And then we talked about political strategy, and there's social awareness and interpersonal influence. There's networking and political savvy. And then lastly, there's apparent sincerity. And I like the way the text talked about apparent. You want leaders that are sincere. You don't want them to just manage or lead with a facade that appears to be sincere, and that's where they dig in, or they delve into the apparent adjective on the sincerity. And then they get into decision-making processes, and that to me goes back to kind of the leader-follower context. We talked about what makes an effective leader, but leaders are in charge of making decisions. They can be autocratic, they can serve as a consultant, they can be participatory, they can be, in that kind of, participation, and they facilitate decisions, or you can delegate if you've got a very strong team. And I've had some very strong teams in the past, and I have not shied away from delegation, because you've got individuals that want to move up that corporate ladder, and the only way they're going to gain the expertise and the experience to help them move up that corporate ladder is if you delegate some of the workload to them and some of the workflow. And I've always liked, I'm not much on autocratic decisions. I've had to make a few in the past where you just could tell that your team just couldn't get from point A to point B and couldn't understand the mechanism, and a decision comes down from senior management, and as a director or even vice president, you just have to make those autocratic decisions and move forward. A couple of other things that want to make sure that we understand and get our arms around before we kind of move forward with chapter 4 is anytime you're in a leadership position, go back and you're struggling with the decision that you have to make, whether it's managing a budget or allocating resources or determining what kind of strategy you're going to follow, especially if you're an entrepreneur. If you're an entrepreneur, you really have to understand, go back to your microeconomic basics. What sets economics apart from the other social sciences, anthropology, political science, psychology, sociology? Economics falls in there as a social science, and social sciences have two things in common. They study choice, why people make choice, and they also try to follow the scientific method as closely as possible. But what sets economics apart from the other social sciences are we're concerned and we're constantly reviewing opportunity cost. What's the next best alternative for using a resource? We're looking at self-interest. And when you talk about self-interest, talking about optimization. And if you're an entrepreneur, you're trying to optimize constantly. You're trying to minimize the cost of production, and you're trying to maximize your revenues because you want, at the end of the day, maximize profits so you have money to go in your pocket. If you're working for a company, and we'll just take managing a budget as an example, you're trying to get as much productivity out of a fixed set of resources, and a fixed set of resources, especially when it comes to labor. And so you're trying to minimize those expenses that you incur in your budget to maximize the potential output and the potential effectiveness of your resources. And then lastly, we're all making decisions at the margin. And if you remember back to your micro classes, because microeconomics, it goes back to ancient Greece, and then it means small. So you're talking about theory of the household, theory of the firm. So if you were like me in my last position working for a large corporation, I was tasked with maximizing the total number of dollars that my team could recover from healthcare claims that were misprocessed. They weren't processed correct, and we had to go back and bring that money back in. So that's what I was trying to maximize, but I was also trying to minimize the budget constraints that I had. So I only had X number of FTEs. I only had X number of dollars to spend on infrastructure. So I was trying to minimize those and manage those expenditures. So I was looking at from a company's perspective, I was going to continue to provide services as long as the marginal revenue is greater than or equal to the marginal cost, and as long as the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. So as a leader, you're always faced with those kind of decisions that take you back to your basic underpinnings or basic foundation of microeconomics. And then the second thing is, and I'm not sure the textbook spends as much time on it as maybe they should, at least they haven't in the earlier chapters, and it's communication. And when I say communication, it can be emails, it can be meetings, it can be informal, catch somebody in the hall and talk to them. It's communication is paramount in being an effective leader, because you're constantly trying to eliminate silos. Individuals in a lot of organizations view information as the key to their success. And a lot of leaders will like to hold on to that information, and for whatever reason, they don't like to share it with their teams. But I've always been an individual in a leadership capacity that is constantly sharing information that I could with the teams. Typically, it was either departmental information or organizational information, and it was kind of a trickle-down theory. It was a push-down theory to the team, the members of the teams, whether they were managers, supervisors, or individual contributors. So you can do that again through emails. You can do it through, weekly meetings. You can have monthly meetings. You can have, especially you need for your direct reports, you need to have monthly evaluations so that everybody knows where they are at any given point in time. And then I always had what I call quarterly business reviews, that we brought the entire team together and talked about, here are the goals of the organization, here are the goals of the department, and here's where we stand. So communication is key to being a successful leader. And I don't know whether through the first 3 or 4 chapters they've spent a lot of time on communication, but don't ever forget that. And then as we jump into chapter 4, we're going to talk about followership, and we're going to talk about managing up and managing sideways. And they point out a key concept, and at the first of the chapter, they talk about not everybody's a follower. Not everybody wants to be a follower. Certain individuals, whether they want to be a follower or not, are almost pushed into that situation, just helping, their peers or helping other team members that can't get from point A to point B. But at the end of the day, whether or not everybody wants to be a follower, we are. I'm a follower, you're a follower. At Blue Cross Blue Shield, I reported up to the vice president of operation, who happened to be the chief actuary. Also, the next rung up the ladder was the CFO. So it doesn't matter where you are in an organization. So my supervisor reported to the CFO reported to the CEO reported to the board. So everybody in that organization was the follower to some extent. So, and I think that is a concept that some individuals tend to lose sight of, because the lessons that they provide or the concepts that they put forth in the text, while they are great for leaders, to me, they're even maybe more important for followers who want to move up that corporate ladder. Followers who see what is expected of leaders in leadership. They see what's expected or is effective on followers or followership, and they can take and build on that as they move up the corporate ladder. Then again, they talk about managing upward, managing sideways with your peers. And while for most individuals, they view management and leadership as kind of trickle down theory, but also you can manage upward, and it doesn't always have to be down. Sometimes you're working for a corporation and your goals come down from up top. So somewhere it's like somebody coming down off the mountain with these goals, and you're not sure where the goals come from. But in effective organizations, what you will find is you start to bring the goals not from top down, but the goals bottom up to the top. So that's kind of what we're looking at as we're starting to move into this chapter 4, and have just a few notes jotted down here. I've always taken the approach with followers as I always want to hire somebody smarter than me, because I want somebody that I can lean on. I don't know everything, and most leaders don't. Most leaders might not admit to it, but most leaders don't, they're not experts in everything. So you always want to hire individuals, at least from my perspective, that are smarter than you are. And you always want to encourage feedback. But the caveat on the feedback is I encourage feedback at every stop I've made, with the understanding that feedback and that pushback be accompanied by information and be accompanied by rationale. Because there may be, as I've developed strategies and goals and visions in the past, I may have missed a few along the way. And as I missed a few along the way, I've always relied on my followers, especially my direct reports, to help push it back and provide information and provide options and probabilities to help refine and improve the effectiveness of those strategies. Your type of followers, they talk about brown nosing, and everybody wants to ingratiate the leader. I've never been a big fan of that. I'd rather have followers that are competent followers that are going to continually to push that envelope and try to help push the team forward. As I've always said, being a leader is not, it's not a popularity contest, unfortunately. So, that's just my approach. And I hope as you read, and we've talked about it in the past, I hope as you read this text, you're looking at these concepts, and I don't want you to take them as the gospel and just, grab them and try to run with them. I want you to be thoughtful. I want you to think through it, and some will work for you and some won't. And they get into, and I think it was on page 50, 51, 52, I can't remember the exact page number, but they have a table and they talk about the types of followers. And they talk about the conformist, and they talk about the alienated, and they talk about the effective. And their definition in the text on a conformist is, a follower who is highly agreeable and ingratiating toward his or her leader, and one who does not rock the boat. Those, and I'm sure that at least those of you that have been out and taken this class, that have been out in the corporate world, maybe as an entrepreneur, or maybe work for another organization, the conformists sometimes are problems for leaders, because you don't want, at least from my perspective, you don't want a bunch of individuals that are going to agree with everything you say. Again, it goes back to leaders aren't perfect. Leaders make mistakes. Leaders aren't experts in every field. So you don't want somebody that's going to try to suck up and what they call it brown nose, and try to move with the leader. And they talk about the thinking style. They're dependent thinkers. They are, I guess they call them uncritical thinkers, type of individuals that want the leaders to tell them, okay, I need you to go from point A to point B, and here's how I want you to go to point A to point B, and I'll check with you every day to make sure you're plodding along and getting to that point. And they typically, the conformists, it's a question mark as how really engaged they are, because as they are brown nosing and trying to ingratiate you don't really know how engaged they are, but they typically are as far as their loyalty to the leader, they're typically pretty strong. And then you've got the alienated, and that's a follower who is critical and an independent thinker, but it's not highly motivated, and they're not highly engaged. And that's a problem. As with the conformists, they're both problems for leaders and followers, because there's nothing worse than your followers seeing, brown nosers and individuals that are only barely meeting the marks. And the same thing, it's from a follower's perspective and a leader's perspective. You don't want somebody that's constantly pushing back, constantly complaining, constantly going against what you think your goals and your missions and your vision should be. So, and they talk about, alienated employees or associates, or followers, depending on what terminology you want to use, that, they are independent thinkers and they are critical thinkers. And I've had some individuals that were alienated and in that out group, and you couldn't get them out of the out group, but they still would end up doing a good job because they didn't want to get fired and they didn't want to leave. So they would always meet the medium, the bottom rung, meets expectations. You hardly ever got them to the point of exceeding expectations, sure didn't even get to the point of the stretch goals, but you could tell that they had the capability. It's just they weren't engaged. They just, and you never knew really where you stood with them, because you didn't know whether they were going to, stab you in the back tomorrow, or they'd come in the next morning, and, it was like, you never knew what kind of an individual you're going to have to deal with on a daily basis. And then you've got the effective type of follower, and they're, they're independent thinkers, they're critical thinkers, they are highly engaged, they have strong loyalty to the leaders. They're going to be up here in this in group when you go back to the LMX theory. So the type of individuals that, as I said, stick their head in the door on a Friday afternoon and said, hey, I'm getting ready to go home, but if there's anything you need, give me a call this weekend. I know we've got a lot going on next week. I'd be happy to step in and help you. Or if you're going to come into the office and work this weekend, give me a call. I'll come in and, be more than willing to help. So they're always looking for additional responsibility. They accept whatever comes of the strategies or the approaches that they implement, especially if they go sideways. So those are the type of individuals that you're looking for. And one quick thing I wanted to kind of throw out there, and I can't remember the first time I heard it, but I did go back and check, and it comes from Paul Arden's Whatever You Think the Opposite book. And he gets into a couple of types of followers. And he talks about, first he talks about steady Eddie. And we've all had, if we've ever been in a management position, you've always had steady Eddies. Those types of individuals that, you can always count on. They're going to be the type of individual that's going to meet expectations, the type of individuals that may occasionally exceed expectations, but that's about it. But they're the kind of individual that you can take and give work to, and that it'll be completed on time. It'll be done for the most part correctly. And it's, they're more than willing to accept the role and the projects and the work that maybe some of the other more highly motivated team members will that don't really want to work on, because to them it's easy. The policies and procedures are there to follow. They can crank the work out, and they can go home and go to sleep at night. And I've had a lot of those type of individuals along the way. In my last stop, I had an individual. The guy was an excellent programmer, but he didn't want to accept any responsibility, didn't want to have to push that envelope. He loved the work he did because he had financial reports that had to be out the 5th of the month, the 10th of the month, the 15th of the month, and then it started the cycle over again. And he knew everything was like clockwork for him. And I couldn't get him to accept any more responsibility. And that was kind of the downside, but the upside was I had individuals that said, hey, let him do it, because we don't want to have to do the mundane work. We want the exciting work, and we want to be able to push that envelope. And that brings me to the terminology that Paul Arden used, and he refers to them, I think, as, if I remember correctly, reckless Erica. And that's kind of the other end. So down here on one end of the spectrum, you had steady Eddie, and up on the other end, you had reckless Erica. And reckless Erica was the kind of individual that was always coming up with these wild ideas, constantly trying to push the envelope. Some of her ideas just did never make sense, but she would throw some ideas out there. It was kind of like they talk about, throwing spaghetti on the wall to see what sticks. So she was just throwing ideas on the wall to see what would stick. And a lot of times you could take her ideas, and while they didn't make sense in that context, you could kind of write them down, and, in a couple of 3 weeks, you're sitting there and you think, and then you start tweaking her ideas, and you could actually work them into strategies that significantly benefited the organization. And I don't know where Paul, I don't remember him in the textbook talking about where he came up with the phrase reckless Erica, but I think in the textbook, I think it was in his textbook, he talked about steady Eddie, and that it came from like Eddie Murray. If you're a baseball fan, can't remember how long ago he played, but he played for the Baltimore, I think it was Baltimore Orioles first baseman, designated hitter, and he'd spent his entire life with the Orioles organization. And that's why they considered him steady Eddie. Could always count on him. He was always there, always working for the good of the organization. But he was not the kind of baseball player that's going to make it to the Hall of Fame. He may have made the All-Star team a few years, but he was just that kind of guy that plodded along and, met expectations. So I think that's where Paul got the terminology of the phrase steady Eddie. But at least it, throws it out there, and it kind of is, as you talk about, as you follow what's in the text. And so you're going conformist, alienated, effective, and you can kind of tie that back to kind of steady Eddie, and you can, reckless Erica, and at least it's just some food for thought. And as you get to know your followers, you're going to start seeing some of them fall into these especially types of followers. And you don't like to pigeonhole people, because I've always found that a lot of your first impressions can change over time. So just keep that in mind as we go forward in the text. That's going to kind of wrap up this piece. And when I come back, we're going to spend a few minutes talking about effective followers. Talk to everybody in a few minutes. Thank you.